I'm Erica, 26 years old, living alone in Mississippi. I don't have many relatives. I've been living with my grandparents in Florida since I was young. I don't know who my father is. As for my mother, according to my grandparents, she was swept away and disappeared in a flood when I was 4 years old. After graduating from college, I moved to Mississippi to live and work. Mississippi is one of those states in the Gulf Coast region, heavily affected by hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. Every year, the government evacuates us to safer areas during disasters. The people here are accustomed to and quite experienced with this. Nevertheless, like everyone else living here, I love the land of Mississippi. 5 years ago, also during a relocation due to a natural disaster, the horrifying story happened, and now looking back, I still feel chills running down my spine. In February 2019, a serious flood occurred in the southern and central regions of Mississippi. There was a significant amount of rainfall, causing millions of dollars in damage and displacing over 15,000 people. My neighbors and I were among them. We were moved to an elementary school where there should be enough sleeping space for the overwhelming number of people. Upon arriving at the temporary shelter area, I called my grandparents to reassure them. We were informed that we would be here for about a week to ensure the flood would subside completely. We were no strangers to relocations like this anymore. People adapted quite easily and quickly. Each person would be provided with personal items, necessary food, and a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was the horrifying nightmare for me after that relocation. Until now, I'm afraid of all the big zipper locking bags. After dinner and personal hygiene, we went to the classrooms to rest. I remember each classroom could accommodate a maximum of 20 people. I found a suitable spot for myself and lay down. I usually read before going to sleep. Luckily, I managed to bring the book I was reading before the relocation. Lying down reading for a while, I noticed a strange woman in the room. She was quite small, with disheveled clothes and a panicked look on her face. She kept pacing around the room, mumbling incessantly, clutching the sleeping bag tightly. I didn't pay much attention to her, continuing to read my book. After a while, when everyone had fallen asleep, I looked at my phone. It was almost midnight. I also marked my page and prepared to go to sleep. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard murmurs from someone. Despite trying to ignore it, it was very clear and close to me. I pulled the sleeping bag down and turned around. My heart seemed to stop for a few seconds. Right in front of me was the face of that woman. She had wide open eyes, staring at me and sporting a sinister smile. Her breath smelled terribly, like a corpse. Reflexively, I sat up, yelled loudly while moving back. Some people who hadn't fallen asleep heard my loud scream and immediately got up to check the situation. The room lights were turned on, and the neighbor asked me what had happened. Terrified, I pointed towards the woman, saying she was very creepy and smelled awful. But looking back, lying asleep in the sleeping bag was an old lady. I stared at her in amazement. While everyone threw me their annoying glances, everyone returned to their place, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. I moved to another corner of the room, pulled the sleeping bag high, leaving only a small hole for air to enter. My heart still hadn't returned to normal beats. After a while, still unable to sleep, I gently pulled the sleeping bag down and looked outside. The woman was lying there, looking at me, but her head was completely turned upside down compared to her body. I tightly shut my mouth, trying not to make any loud noises. I pulled the zipper off the sleeping bag to cover my body completely, trying to regulate my breathing. I closed my eyes, put on my headphones, and fell asleep without knowing when. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing I did was look around the room. The woman had disappeared. About 4 days later, everything went on as usual. I never met that woman again. People in the shelter didn't care or remember anything about her. We were all happy when the government announced that the flood had completely receded. After today, we can safely return home and resume our normal lives. That night, I don't remember how long I slept. A foul smell hit my nose, causing me to wake up in a daze. That terrible smell made me wake up immediately. I sat up, looked around. Everyone was still sleeping. Turning to the left, I saw someone lying next to me, the sleeping bag covering the entire body. My neighbor Maria was lying on the right. I shook her awake. I asked her if she smelled anything unpleasant. Maria sniffed, looked around, then said she didn't smell anything and went back to sleep. But the smell of decay was very clear. Why didn't anyone else smell it? The next morning I woke up. That foul smell was still there. It made me extremely dizzy and nauseous. Everyone was quickly packing up to go home. The person in the sleeping bag next to me still hadn't woken up. I was surprised, reached out to wake that person up. As soon as I touched the sleeping bag, a loud noise rang out, making me startled. I called out loudly a few more times, but the person inside the sleeping bag still didn't respond. I trembled, reached out to pull the zipper of the bag down. Inside the sleeping bag was a rotting corpse. I immediately screamed loudly and jumped out of control. People around came to help me calm down. I was crying and trembling, trying to tell them about the terrifying thing inside the sleeping bag. Once again, the incomprehensible looks were staring at me. A man came over, picked up the sleeping bag. A few snacks and a bottle fell out from inside. He looked at me uncomfortably, saying it was his sleeping bag and I should stop making such a fuss. I was panicked. Finally, what was going on? Why was I the only one seeing those terrifying things? On the way home, I heard the radio on the bus recounting the case of a woman. Her name was Luisa. 22 years ago, when she was 27 years old. She was a single mother who was swept away by the flood while going to pick up her 4-year-old daughter from school. Luisa's body was never found. I was stunned. My whole body was freezing cold. I remembered the horrific image of that woman. She had eyes very similar to my mother's.
I'm Dylan, 38 years old. I work as a financial analyst for a bank in San Jose. I don't have a girlfriend, nor do I have plans for married life. I'm quite introverted and a workaholic. Instead of finding myself a girlfriend and having sweet dates, I often work late at the company, sometimes even until night. One Wednesday evening, I remember leaving the office at 11 p.m. That day I didn't drive to work. I stood in front of the company to catch a taxi. It's strange because this area usually has many taxis, but today I've been waiting for 20 minutes and still haven't seen any passing by. After a stressful day at work, I'm tired and starting to lose patience. It's almost 11:30 p.m. and a taxi suddenly arrives. I can't wait any longer and jump onto the road to flag down the vehicle. The taxi driver looks at me with panic, probably because of my somewhat crazy actions. The driver looks at me and then looks over to the passenger seat, appearing very panicked and worried. I glance over to the passenger seat, and it turns out this taxi already has a passenger. It's a girl. She's leaning her head against the window, seeming either drunk or quite tired. The taxi driver lowers the window, wearing a black face mask. He looks at me with concern. "Sorry, sir, I already have a passenger," he says. I'm too tired to wait for another taxi. I suggest that the driver lets me ride along, and he can drop off the girl first to maintain the order of the taxi call. He looks worriedly at the girl for a long time before turning to me. When I offer to pay double the fare, he reluctantly agrees. Getting into the car, I smell a strong smell of alcohol, so the girl must be drunk. The driver asks for my home address. He says that my house is closer than the girl's, so he'll drop me off first. I thank him. Out of appreciation, I engage in conversation and ask for her name, but he doesn't answer. I assume he's tired, so I keep quiet. I'm a bit curious, so I observe the girl. She looks quite young, probably in her early 20s. Her skin is pale, and her long hair covers most of her face. Despite the hot weather, she's wearing a high-neck sweater. The car suddenly brakes hard, and everything lurches forward. The driver says there was a cat crossing the road. I hear the girl's head bump against the car quite hard, but she doesn't react, still deeply asleep. I want to help her sit up straight, but the driver immediately refuses. He uses one hand to awkwardly adjust her sitting position. After a while, I suddenly smell a strong odor. I'm not sure, the smell of alcohol is still very strong. I look out realizing we're almost home, so I proactively pay the taxi fare. When I say I want to pay through the ride-hailing app, the driver immediately refuses, saying I should pay in cash. I don't have enough cash, so I hope he'll pass by the nearest ATM. The driver suddenly shows annoyance, urging me to hurry up. I withdraw money as quickly as possible. When I return to the car, I accidentally catch a glimpse of the girl's pale face sitting in the passenger seat. I freeze for a few seconds, wanting to observe her more closely. Surprisingly, I catch the cold gaze of the driver. I quickly get into the car and pay the taxi fare. The amount I give him is quite large, and I request change, but he refuses, saying he doesn't have any cash here. The more the driver gives me a sense of unease. Finally, I arrive home. It's almost 1 a.m. As I get out of the car before I can close the door, the taxi speeds away. Entering the house, images of that girl and the driver keep appearing in my mind. After showering, I go upstairs and fall asleep immediately. The next day is a day off, and I wake up quite late. I watch the news on TV, and they report a carjacking incident involving a taxi company. The driver of that taxi was repeatedly beaten on the head and died early this morning at the hospital. Along with that serious carjacking is the disappearance of a young girl named Alida. Putting everything together, I suddenly remember the taxi driver and the girl from last night. I will call the police to report everything I witnessed, but my phone has disappeared. I sit for a moment, trying to remember where I left it. On the taxi, I probably dropped it when I got out of the car. I call the police on the landline, recounting everything I witnessed. Using the GPS on my phone, the police quickly locate the stolen taxi. It's on an empty lot 40 kilometers away from the city. The car is running out of gas and both doors are wide open. Inside the car, on the passenger seat, the police discover blood soaked into the seat cushion and dried. About a week later, the police find the body of the missing girl under a tree, 10 kilometers from the location of the taxi. The girl's body has a long slash across her neck, which is the direct cause of her death. Through investigation, the police conclude that the girl found under the tree is the same girl in the taxi that I met that night. The driver's name was actually her terrible boyfriend impersonating. His name is Gary. After getting drunk, Gary brutally murdered his own girlfriend and tried to destroy the body. All evidence pointed to Gary being guilty, but the next challenge for the police was to find him. There were no clues left behind, and that murderer seemed to have vanished from this world. I am still shivered thinking about that night. I sat with the body of a girl with a brutal murderer for 30 minutes in the car.
I'm Lonnie, 18 years old, the only daughter in the family. My family lives in the town of Atherton, California. The name Lonnie that I have also reflects the love that everyone has for me. Since I was little, I have always been described as a healthy, beautiful, and nice girl. Perhaps many people would think that I am so beautiful partly inherited from my parents. But no, my parents look very different. My father is much older than his age. I don't have any resemblance to my father. My mother has pale, sallow skin, a thin and lifeless body. The lines on my mother's face are very beautiful, but they are not well taken care of. I often see my mother sitting alone with a pale and tired face. I would run to hug her and ask if she was okay. Mom would always smile kindly, hug me tightly, and cry for a long time. I was educated by my parents, and especially my grandmother, to be a good girl and not putting my nose into other people's affairs. So I grew up in a cocoon of love and affection. I was carefree and obedient to adults. Even in situations I didn't like, I wouldn't resist or argue. Speaking of my grandmother, her name is Ira. My grandmother is very young and beautiful. Completely different from my mother. My grandmother has fair, smooth skin, a firm and attractive figure, even though she's almost 60 years old. I know my grandmother is a single mother. She has only one child, my father. I have never seen her mention any other relatives. And I also don't know anyone other than my father, mother, and grandmother. My grandmother's house is about a 30-minute drive from my house. My parents would take me to stay with her every weekend. My grandmother is very gentle. She teaches me to always love and take care of myself. Do not let any dirty marks appear on your skin because you will look very ugly. Your hair must always be fragrant and smooth. The clothes you wear must be the most beautiful and expensive. Do not eat food which origins are unknown. You must eat food prepared by your mother's own hands or prepared by me. Those are the things my grandmother always teaches me since I was little. Every weekend, staying with my grandmother made me very happy because I felt loved very much. One weekend, my parents took me to visit her. When she saw the small scratches on my nails, my grandmother got angry with my parents. On such occasions, I always saw my mother's face full of fear and panic. My mother dared not speak up. There's another strange thing. Every time my parents took me to visit my grandmother, my mother and grandmother would go into a separate room to talk. Dad and I would wait outside. I would look towards the door of my grandmother's room. It would be a long time before they came out. I would run to hug my mother again, every time I saw the fatigue and discomfort on her face. On my mother's hand, every time they came out of my grandmother's room, there would always be a plaster. My mother would try to shield it with her hand, but I always saw it. In the summer of the year I finished middle school, my grandmother said my parents should let me stay with her for a long time. During the days at my grandmother's house, I got to know a neighbor boy my age named Mike. Mike is kind and funny. We quickly became friends. One day, while playing with Mike, I accidentally slipped and fell. Mike quickly helped me up. Blood was flowing from my hand. I was worried that I would be scolded more than worrying about the wound. My grandmother suddenly appeared with a terrifying, angry face. She grabbed my hand, looked at the bleeding wound, took a deep breath. I thought she was trying to calm down. Mike, seeing my grandmother's angry face, stood frozen in fear. Both Mike and I seemed unable to breathe, staring intently at my grandmother. My grandmother held my hand, slowly led me closer to Mike. Then, my grandmother looked at me, looked at the wound on my hand, then turned to look at Mike. Very quickly, strongly, and decisively, my grandmother slapped Mike hard. She shouted loudly, demanding that Mike stay away from me forever. I looked at Mike, feeling guilty for my friend, but I didn't dare to speak up for him. I just bowed my head and remained silent, because I was very scared. My grandmother took me home. I always had to prepare mentally for her punishment. But grandmother gently sat down beside me, lifted my injured arm to observe. Then, my grandmother kissed the wound. I looked at her in surprise. My blood was smeared all over my grandmother's mouth. She looked at me, smiling kindly as usual, but mysteriously and frighteningly. She said she would help me bandage the wound and then lick the blood on her mouth, an expression of satisfaction. I was very scared. My emotions were chaotic. I sat there motionless, afraid to speak up, just silent. The terrifying strictness and surveillance of my grandmother as I approached the age of 18, it made me suffocate. I began to notice my mother's aging more and more clearly and quickly, while my grandmother's beauty seemed to last forever. I was old enough to understand and wanted to find out about everything. My grandmother always remained silent in the face of my questions. One evening, when my family was having dinner with my grandmother, my mother suddenly collapsed on the dining table and fainted. I worriedly tried to wake my mother up while my father called for an ambulance. I felt chilled by the indifferent gaze and the faint smile on my grandmother's lips. My mother was diagnosed with severe anemia and passed away after being hospitalized for a day. I was completely devastated. I lost one of my 3 closest relatives too suddenly. My mother's funeral was as cold and fleeting as the way my mother left me. I had to take nearly a month off from school because my mental state was unstable. One day, I came home from school. Passing by my parents' room, I suddenly heard my grandmother's voice. I gently approached to listen. "She's almost 18. Quickly find another replacement and nurture her well. Our bodies only suit the cleanest and purest things." I looked through the crack in the door, horrified to see an old, ugly woman with red glowing eyes drinking a bowl of blood. Blood dripping down her chin and neck. That elderly face gradually rejuvenated. Her eyes returned to normal. It was my grandmother. The drops of blood fell to the floor, being licked clean by my father, who knelt down. The satisfaction on their faces, along with the maniacal laughter, completely destroyed me.
I am Joseph, 27 years old, currently working in real estate. My girlfriend Sarah and I have been together for 8 years. She is 2 years younger than me. Although we haven't made plans to get married, we've been living together for 2 years now. We reside in a comfortable house I bought in Austin, Texas. Sarah is amazing. She's beautiful and understanding. We share everything and do everything together. I often take her to gatherings with friends and business partners. People often tell me how lucky I am to have Sarah. I have a close friend named Charles, and Sarah has a close friend named Selena. Charles has been hitting on Selena, and he asked Sarah and me for help in winning her over. It would be great if they became a couple. We've been happy together until one day. That day, I had an important meeting with clients, so I told Sarah I would be home late. Around 6 p.m., Sarah texted me that she had already arrived home. Feeling reassured, I continued my work, planning to surprise Sarah with a bouquet of sunflowers when I got home. Sunflowers are her favorite flowers. But things didn't go as planned. I ended up coming home 3 hours later than expected. I hurriedly called Sarah right after finishing my work, but she didn't answer. When I arrived home, it was nearly midnight and the lights were still on. I thought Sarah was waiting for me. Entering the house with the bouquet and a cheerful smile, I called out to her, but there was no response. I hung up my coat and put down my laptop, holding the bouquet, and rushed to the kitchen. She wasn't there, although the dining table was set and the food had gone cold. I found it odd. Perhaps Sarah was upset that I was late. I ran upstairs to the bedroom, but it was dark inside. I turned on the light, but Sarah wasn't there. She wasn't in the bathroom or the study either. I started to feel worried. Sarah never gets upset for no reason, and she wouldn't leave me without saying anything to me. Searching throughout the house again, I urgently called Sarah's phone. The ringing echoed somewhere. I chuckled, thinking Sarah was just playing a prank on me. Following the sound of the ringing phone, I once again felt disappointed and more worried. Sarah's phone was lying in the kitchen sink. I unlocked her phone, and the screen displayed our ongoing conversation. Her message asking me when I would be home hadn't been sent. I began to panic. Sarah had never behaved like this before. I called Sarah's parents and her best friend Selena. They all said Sarah hadn't been to their places and hadn't been in touch. I searched the house again, praying that this was just one of Sarah's jokes. I felt utterly helpless and panicked. I called the police to report Sarah missing. They told me to calm down. She might have gone somewhere and forgotten to take her phone. They asked me to wait until the next morning. I was extremely anxious and I couldn't sleep that night, pacing back and forth in the living room hoping to see Sarah's silhouette. Sarah didn't return, and the police began their investigation. The last surveillance camera footage showed her walking home, carrying a bag. She hadn't left the house since then. There were no signs of forced entry into the house. Nothing valuable was taken. Could Sarah have disappeared? With no leads, the police investigation began to stall. I felt like I was going crazy, not being able to find Sarah or understand why she disappeared. A week later, I received the devastating news that Charles, my best friend, was also missing. Coincidentally, Sarah and Charles went missing on this same day. I was plunged into despair. My intuition about this wasn't good at all. Nearly a month after Sarah and Charles went missing, my health and work deteriorated significantly. Several times I met Selena, but she didn't seem concerned about Sarah and Charles. Selena had a new boyfriend. Stupid. That girl and Charles disappeared at the same time, and you didn't notice anything unusual? They're probably having a good time somewhere. I regret trusting these two. Selena's words shocked me. My intuition always being vigilant, I searched the house again. Standing in front of the door leading to the basement, my heart raced and I struggled to breathe. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. A strong smell of death hit my nostrils. In the corner of the basement was Sarah, wearing the dress I had given her. But she didn't look like my beautiful Sarah anymore. Next to her on the floor lay Charles. I recognized his familiar figure. He lay there, arms reaching towards the door. Panic and agony overwhelmed me. I couldn't remember how long I stood there trying to compose myself and call the police. After the autopsies, the police revealed Sarah's cause of death was suffocation due to strangulation, along with signs of assault. Charles was determined to have died after Sarah, with multiple stab wounds to his abdomen and chest. At the crime scene next to Sarah and Charles' bodies, the police found a kitchen knife. There were Sarah's fingerprints on the handle and Charles's on the blade. That knife was one of the set in my kitchen. What horrifying event had occurred to them? Now I understood why Charles always tried to meet Sarah. Was there really a relationship between Sarah and Charles that I didn't know about? Selena's words contained some secret. Losing Sarah was truly painful and horrifying to me. I'm Victor, 25 years old, living in Utah. I have a very close friend named Rose. We have known each other since college. After graduation, I settled and worked in Utah to be close to family, while Rose moved to Washington for work. Even though we were quite far apart, every year Rose and I would try to arrange our schedules to meet up or travel together. That year, we planned a 5-day vacation at Huntington Beach, California. Rose and I had sorted out our work schedules. Because we were far apart, we both took the initiative to travel from our respective locations and meet in California. On the first day of the vacation, I was luckier than Rose as my flight went smoothly. However, Rose's flight encountered some issues, and she called me to say she would be about 3 hours late. I was somewhat disappointed that things didn't go according to plan right on the first day. But there was nothing to be done about it, so I went to Starbucks at the airport to buy some coffee and pastries. After sitting in Starbucks for a while, I started to feel a bit suffocated. I decided to return to the airport lounge to wait for Rose since she would have an easier time finding me there. A while later, while looking at my phone, a man nearby caught my attention. He seemed to be struggling with his suitcase. It looked like he was asking a few people nearby to hold his suitcase for him, but no one was willing to help. He appeared quite flustered and anxious, constantly looking at his watch. I also glanced at the time on my phone, realizing Rose's flight wouldn't arrive for another hour. Thinking I had plenty of time, I decided to approach and help him. He was very grateful, continuously thanking me. He introduced himself as Egan. Egan said he would be back in 30 minutes and handed me a piece of paper with a phone number before hurriedly leaving. The paper was typed neatly, not handwritten. I didn't get a chance to ask Egan what he was up to, but I wasn't curious anyway. I continued waiting at the airport, this time waiting for both Egan and Rose. 30 minutes passed, but Egan hadn't returned yet, so I told myself I'd wait a little longer to see what happened. Lost in my phone, when I looked up again, Egan was already 20 minutes late. I called the phone number Egan had given me, but it said the number didn't exist. I double-checked the number I dialed, and it matched the one on the paper Egan left behind. I tried calling many times more, but the phone kept saying the number didn't exist. I started to panic, unsure if this Egan guy was just messing with me or had some other motive. All I had was this piece of paper with a phone number that I couldn't contact. All I could do was wait and hope that Egan would return soon because I had a long itinerary with Rose. 20 more minutes passed and Egan still hadn't shown up. At this point, I was extremely anxious. I searched the suitcase for any accurate contact information Egan might have left behind. As I sat down to inspect the suitcase, I noticed it was nearly soaked, with a faint pink liquid dripping onto the floor. It had a strong, familiar smell, like the cleaning solution I often used. The suitcase was quite old and even its lock was broken. It seemed like the contents had shifted and leaked out. I was disappointed not to find any other personal information about Egan. Later, Rose arrived and we were happy to see each other. Rose was excited to continue the planned vacation, but I needed to deal with the suitcase first. We decided to take it to the airport security personnel. As we started moving, I was surprised by how heavy the suitcase was. It estimated to be about 120 pounds. I asked Rose to pull her suitcase so that I could move Egan's suitcase more easily. Struggling to pull Egan's suitcase ahead, Rose followed behind. After a while, the sound of tearing fabric made me quite uneasy. Looking back, the suitcase seemed fine, so I continued moving. Suddenly, there was a loud tearing sound, and Rose immediately screamed and collapsed. When I turned around, the sight before me left me petrified. From inside the suitcase, a neck was protruding. I emphasized that it was the neck of a headless body. People around us noticed, screamed in fear. Many of them panicked and ran away. Rose had fainted and I was terrified and confused. My brain couldn't process, think, or function anymore. I sat down on the floor staring helplessly at my dear friend. Airport police arrived quickly, and the suitcase containing the body was taken to the station. Rose was taken to the medical room. The police asked me many questions, but all I could provide was the piece of paper Egan had given me. It was then that I realized something was wrong. The phone number on the paper was typed, indicating that everything was premeditated rather than spontaneous. Why didn't I realize it at the time? The police used data from the security camera and provided it to me for identification. It was the blonde man who had given me the suitcase. I was detained at the airport police station for the next 2 days to coordinate the investigation. The body in the suitcase was examined, and the identity was determined. It was a high school girl reported missing by her family 3 days ago. After investigating all the citizen records, the police identified the man in the security camera footage. That man's name was Joe, not Egan, a 17-year-old teenager living in Michigan. Realizing the absurdity, the police continued investigating the fingerprints on the paper scrap in the suitcase. Strangely, the fingerprints found did not match those in the population management database. They also did not match the fingerprints of the teenager named Joe. In the end, who was that man? And why was he so ruthless? I was truly exhausted by those horrifying events. My and Rose's vacation was ruined. I should have been more vigilant and noticed the strange thing about Egan's paper. My trust and kindness were exploited. Even today, almost 5 years after that incident, I still can't escape from that horrifying story.